Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us again today. For those of you that have been to our webinars before, thanks for joining us again. For the newcomers, thank you very much. Before we kick off, I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Firstly, we'll start with some housekeeping. So our privacy statement is available, and the link will be placed on the chat. Just a reminder that we are recording the session. The recording will be sent out to everyone who is registered. So please note that any information that you provide will be managed in accordance with our privacy policy. You can find the link, as I said, on the chat. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box, and we will leave about 10 minutes or so at the end of the session to go through them. We're all professionals here. If you have a question that resonates with you, please feel free to answer and engage positively. We want to keep this a safe space to share knowledge and ideas. At the end, we'll have a lucky door prize. So if you've been here before, you know that we give away a free coaching session with Support Coordination Academy. The winner will be drawn at the end of the session, so make sure you stay right till the end. I'd like to let you all know, for those of you that are in New South Wales, we have our Penrith Learning and Lifestyle Hub open day, which will be on the 28th of August. There's information on our Facebook, and we would love to see you there if you can make it. We're also really excited and pleased to announce the launch of the Support Coordinator Hub on the Endeavour Foundation website. The hub is specifically designed to support coordinators with resources including articles, blogs, webinars, service brochures, NDIS quick links, frequently asked questions, and professional development tools. We'll add the link in the chat. So please take a moment to check all these resources. Mary from Support Coordination Academy is facilitating our session today, and we'll be exploring the important topic of NDIS reasonable and necessary criteria. Now, before I hand over to Mary, our facilitator for today, I'd like to introduce you all to Shania Brennan. Shania is the Acting Business Development Specialist at Endeavour Foundation and leads a team of social workers and disability specialists advocating for our clients. With qualifications in psychology, HR management, and social work, and 8 years in community sector, Shania is passionate about empowering vulnerable people to have choice and control over their lives. Over to you, Shania.
Hello, everybody. It is lovely to be here with you all today. Today's topic on the reasonable and necessary criteria is a big one, and I know that Mary will go into all of this in more detail shortly. I firstly wanted to introduce the reasonable and necessary criteria and briefly talk about how Endeavour Foundation uses this in practice. As I'm sure most of you know, the reasonable and necessary criteria is found in the NDIS Act and are the criteria that must be met for a participant to receive funding in any part of their NDIS plan. There are 4 guiding principles that make up the reasonable and necessary criteria, and they are, as you can see here on the slide, supports need to relate to your disability, be value for money, be effective and beneficial, and must be appropriately funded by the NDIS. For a participant to receive funding, the funding being requested, it must meet all of the criteria, and we need to have the supporting evidence to demonstrate the participant's need for that support. So, what is Endeavour Foundation's approach, and as a service provider, and how can we help you? We strive to work collaboratively, both internally and externally, with stakeholders involved in a participant's life. And this includes the participant as we adopt person-centered practice, which I know was actually the discussion topic for last month's forum. Most, if not all of you, will be aware that when we're submitting any kind of request for review to the NDIA, we need to provide supporting evidence that will evidence the reasonable and necessary criteria for a participant to be successful in obtaining that funding. As a service provider, there is particular supporting evidence that you can ask us to provide that will evidence this criteria. And you can see some of those on the slide here under the Endeavour Foundation table. In addition to what we can provide as a service provider, any allied health professionals that are also engaged with a participant can also provide their own reports, which are just phenomenal, and they also further evidence a participant's support needs. And you can see some of those which I've listed, but that's definitely not an extensive list. Endeavour Foundation have a number of teams that can be involved in a participant's care, and we work collaboratively to provide quality supporting evidence for you as support coordinators to submit to the NDIA. As you can see here on the slide, some Endeavour teams that may be involved are our COS and SIL teams, our service delivery, NDIS coordination, and our complex support teams. It is important for us to remember that one of the guiding principles for the reasonable and necessary criteria was that the support must be appropriately funded by the NDIS. As you know, there are many support systems in place in Australia that address different areas of need for our population. And what this means is that we need to demonstrate through the supporting evidence that the support can best be provided by the NDIS and not another system. Some of those systems you can see here on the slide, and this can become more complex when a participant is diagnosed with, say, a mental health condition that is also a recognised disability by the NDIS. We need to be able to demonstrate why the NDIS is the best system to provide support to that individual. Evidencing the reasonable and necessary criteria is a big part of my role with Endeavour Foundation, and I thought I would also use this opportunity to talk about some examples of how we were able to demonstrate a participant's increased need for support through the reasonable and necessary criteria. Before I start, I just want to note that the participants' names have been changed to protect their privacy. We have Jason. Now, Jason is diagnosed with Down syndrome, and most recently, he was also diagnosed with dementia. Now, dementia is recognised by the NDIS due to the genetic link between Down syndrome and dementia. Jason lives in a supported independent living home and is supported various ratios of 1:1 to 1:3 each day. Since his dementia diagnosis, Jason has exhibited cognitive and physical decline. He's become forgetful. He struggles to identify time and place without support. He's had an increase in falls and instability. He's unable to manage his medication independently and has a reduced capacity to follow his routine without support. So currently, Jason receives 2 hours of support per day for self-care, medication, mealtime management at a 1:1. So what was identified was that he needed an increase to his 1:1 support from 2 hours a day to 4 hours a day. And this was deemed reasonable and necessary because it supported him to stay safe and continue working towards his NDIS goals. It was value for money and beneficial and effective because he can still share his supports overall, but requires some extra support in the mornings and evenings to set him up to be successful during those shared support times. It also allowed him to maintain his independence in other areas of life where he didn't require as much support. So when we also look at the consideration around whether the NDIS was the best system to support Jason, we highlighted the following. Jason's reduced cognitive and physical capacity was a direct impact from his disability diagnosis of Down syndrome. And because dementia has that genetic link that is recognised by the NDIS, it meant that the NDIS was the most appropriate system to fund Jason's supports. And it wouldn't be reasonable for another system to deliver those services. I would like to also share another brief example about Helen. Again, Helen's name has been changed to protect her privacy. Helen has a primary disability of Fragile X syndrome. Helen also has further disability diagnoses, including intellectual disability, obsessive compulsive disorder, and schizophrenia. Helen lives in a supported independent living home with 2 other people and is currently funded at a shared support ratio of 1:3 with 4 hours of one-to-one support each day. Helen has complex behaviours that occur which are associated with her diagnoses of OCD and schizophrenia, and she has a positive behaviour support plan in place to support her. Recently, Helen's support team have identified that there are excessive periods of her shared support time at the 1-3 that are being directed towards her because she's struggling with hallucinations and intrusive thoughts that are distressing and require some more intensive support to help return her to baseline. To ensure Helen's support and safety needs are met, she needed a change to her shared support from 1-3 to 1-2 during the day. And this was deemed reasonable and necessary because it would support Helen to engage safely at home and build on her capacity to self-regulate. And it also meant that she could continue to receive support in a shared model, but just in a way that better addressed her support needs. When we again look at the consideration around whether the NDIS was the best system to support Helen, we were able to identify that Helen's reduced capacity for self-regulation was a direct impact from her disabilities, which were recognised by the NDIS, and her positive behaviour support plan has provided strategies to support her behaviours, but she required increased support to ensure that those strategies were successful. Therefore, the NDIS was the most appropriate system. There are many examples that I could share with you, but I do hope that these two help and help to further evidence or identify the reasonable and necessary criteria. And I'm now going to hand over to Mary, who will continue taking us through today's session. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, hi everyone. How are you going? Thanks a lot for that. It was really, really awesome. Some really good examples, and it just really clearly shows the level of evidence that's required to be able to meet the reasonable and necessary decision-making criteria. So, hi everyone. I'm Mary from Support Coordination Academy, and I'm going to be talking to you about reasonable and necessary. So today we're going to be looking at what is the reasonable and necessary criteria and why do support coordinators need to understand it. The reason you need to understand it is because it's part of your capacity building role it's around that coaching, refine and review. So you're really supporting participants and the extended support network to understand what reasonable and necessary means, how the NDIS make decisions around whether the support is most appropriately funded by the NDIS, and it really builds a person's capacity to actually understand that government structure, which is really quite confusing, but also their capacity to actually identify for themselves whether it's an NDIS support or whether a support can actually be sourced through mainstream or community, so it's really about that part of that capacity building role. So let's continue on. Okay. So again, reasonable and necessary criteria. So we're going to delve into this. I've got quite a lot of information. And I do tend to talk quite quickly. So I will try and slow that down. And I've got lots and lots of examples. So hopefully that will be a lot better. And we will delve into it now. So again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat. At the end of the session, we will bring them, we'll try and make some time at the end of the session to answer any questions. If we can't answer the questions that you put into the chat, then Endeavour will actually send me those questions and I'll respond to them and they'll send them out to you. And they'll be part of probably that frequently asked questions. So here we go. Right, reasonable and necessary decision-making criteria. So the reasonable and necessary decision-making criteria is legislated under the NDIS Act, but in practical terms, this means that an NDIS delegate or a planner or whoever that delegate might be has to justify the approval of funding on a participant's NDIS plan by evidencing the support meets all of the reasonable necessary criteria. So not just one of them, but all of them. And this is for all supports that are provided or funded on a participant's plans, but also those supports that are not. So there needs to be a justification about why the support wasn't approved. So when the NDIS make this assessment, they consider a participant's whole plan. So not just the individual supports in isolation. They look at the overall plan and the supports approved to make sense that the support types and the amounts complement each other to support the participant to live an ordinary life. And we're going to clarify what that means later on. So alongside the reasonable necessary criteria, when a delegate is approving the plan, they also consider a participant's goals and aspirations, their strengths, capacity, and individual circumstances, the barriers to accessing those supports. So there are any limitations or restrictions the participant faces to access the supports they need, their disability-related support needs, and if there are any risks and safeguards or barriers that they need to consider. So it's quite holistic focus that gets taken into consideration when we're looking at the reasonable and necessary criteria. So we're going to go through the reasonable and necessary criteria and delve into it and to help you understand as support coordinators how you need to understand it so that you can apply it, but also support a participant to understand it and problem solve to identify whether it's the NDIS is the most appropriate solution. Okay. Right, let's go in. So something to be really clear about, and I talk to support coordinators about this all the time, it's not a support coordinator's role to make decisions or tell a participant about what they can and can't access within the NDIS. So I'll clarify that. I often hear support coordinators saying, oh, no, they should be able to get that. No, they can get that. And I've already talked to them about that. And no, I don't understand why the NDIS is saying that they can't get it. So I suppose it's not about us making that decision or telling a participant that this is absolutely going to happen, because it's setting up unrealistic expectations. Our role is to help a person understand what each criteria means and apply the support that's been requested to that criteria. That helps a person build their capacity to do that problem solving themselves and understand how the NDIS actually works and how they make their decisions. Hopefully that clarifies what I've just said. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so the first criteria needs to relate to a participant's disability. So when I work with, especially in our coaching sessions, when I work with people and they've said to me, oh, I've been through these report writing and I've recommended all these reports and they weren't approved, when we go back and we break it down around the evidence that was provided or the information that was provided, this is a process that we go through. So we kind of go, okay, so in the information or the evidence that you provided, how have you evidenced that this is a disability-related support need? Okay. So the evidence needs to demonstrate how the person's disability impacts on their functional capacity to complete everyday activities and how that impact creates barriers to the person being able to access the supports they need and achieve their goals. Okay, so the support coordinator's role is to identify the evidence required to substantiate the need for the support. So for example, I'll give you an example. So say you're working with a participant who has an intellectual disability, whose goal is to increase their inclusion within their local community. So after planning with the person and their support network, you identify the person's interests and options available, and the participant decides that they are keen to, so part of their passion is around animals. So they want to volunteer at a dog shelter. So when you're exploring these options of how the person can connect and volunteer at their local shelter, you identify that the person requires support person to go with them to access, manage and maintain that volunteering opportunity. So this directly relates to the functional impact of their disability. So the functional impact of their disability creates barriers to being able to process and retain new information, to problem solve and understand complex situations. So hopefully that's a good example about how you need to link this back to how this is disability related needs. Yeah, it's linking back to those significantly functional capacity domains that people use to evidence how that the impairment of their disability significantly impacts on their ability to complete day-to-day activities. It's why they have access to the scheme. Yeah, it's about linking it back to that. This really helps you to articulate NDIS language or use that NDIS language. Okay. Sometimes, however, when you're working with a participant, I know I've had this question quite a few times, is that when someone starts working with a participant, and probably an example that Brianna was just working before, they often have a primary disability, which could be a Down syndrome, and then they have an additional disability that wasn't actually picked up or a part of their access process. It might have happened after they joined the scheme, or it's something that wasn't really accounted for or documented as part of the NDIS system. So when this happens, the NDIS need to assess additional impairments meet the same eligibility criteria, and I'm meaning the access criteria. It's not meaning that someone needs to go through a whole access process, but support coordinators often say to me, well, how do we ensure that this is documented as part of the NDIS profile for that participant? So what a support coordinator needs to do is gather evidence around the disability related criteria. If you go back to the access criteria, there's a disability related criteria. So you'd need to provide evidence to gather how the impairment relates to a loss or significant change in a body's function, the structure, or how they think and learn. This is all, if you go back to the operational guidelines for how to access to the NDIS, all of this information is in there. That the impairment is likely to be permanent and lifelong, and the impairment substantially reduces the person's functional capacity to complete or participate in daily activities. Again, this relates back to those 6 domains that we were talking about before. So thinking about if a person is wanting to, talking to you about a support that they need, and it doesn't relate to the disability or the impairment that they use to apply to the NDIS. The impairment is not part of their profile. So you've checked with the NDIS, you've gathered the information, or you've requested the information around the access criteria and around the impairment that is identified as their primary or secondary disability. If it's additional and you believe it would meet the disability criteria, gathering that evidence is supporting a person, that would be the first step. And then it would be, once that's been recognised by the NDIS, then you would be supporting the participant in relation to the need for a disability-related need. Hopefully that's making sense and I'm not too confusing. Okay. Right, here we go. Related to a participant's goals. These are the steps that I go through when I'm working with participants to really help them to understand and unpack and problem solve. So first of all, I say, how does it relate to the impact of disability? I don't use it in those terms. We kind of talk about what is their disability, how does that impact on them on their daily life, and then we talk about how that support directly relates to that. And then we go to how does it relate to your goals? So, okay, so how will the support help a participant to pursue their goals and aspirations by supporting them to overcome barriers to achieving their goals? The NDIS refers to overcoming barriers in a way that increases the participant's independence and capacity to pursue their life goals and lead an ordinary life. We keep hearing this term, ordinary life. The NDIS refers to an ordinary life as when a participant has the same opportunities as people without a disability do, where they can pursue their potential and participate in society on an equal basis with others. So that's what the NDIS is referring to. The NDIS refer to common things that improve the quality of our lives. So think of these when I work with support coordinators and we are building skills around report writing, but also around understanding goals. I always talk to support coordinators about what is the goal, but what does it actually mean to the participant? So what does it mean to them? Because what it says on their plan might be completely different, but also how will you know when that goals will be achieved? What are the actions that will be taken to achieve that goal? And what will that actually look like? So when I talk about some of these common things that the NDIS refer to, think of these around like outcomes to be achieved. So positive relationships with families, friends, people within their community, a sense of belonging. So to family, their support network, their culture, their community, workplace, society, having individual autonomy. So being independent or increasing independence and having the same opportunities as other people without a disability. So being actively involved in decision making. So being able to make informed decisions and having the capacity for choice and control over supports and services. Developing skills and strengths. So this enables a participant to experience and overcome challenges and being able to experience that sense of achievement and enjoyment. Being active in society. So being able to actively contribute to their local community and society in general. So again, when you're relating a support back to a participant's goal, what is it? What does it mean to the participant? But what are the outcomes to be achieved by this support being put in place? Okay. Social and economic participation. Hopefully I'm not talking too quickly. Social and economic participation. Quite broad. How will the support help a participant to undertake activities that will increase their social and economic participation in society? So basically, after working with a participant in their network to identify how the support is directly related to the impact of the person's disability, the next step is to understand how the support will increase their capacity to access community and society. So one way to do this is to focus on the barriers a participant experiences and how overcoming these barriers will increase this capacity. So barriers will be different for each person a support coordinator is working with, as they are dependent on each person's unique situation. So these could include physical barriers, so unable to communicate needs, trouble processing or retaining information, unable to access the community, challenges with mobility. They could include psychological barriers, so inability to manage household or develop a routine, manage daily lives like hygiene. Many of these factors impact on a person's ability to initiate and follow through with tasks. Barriers could also be due to a cognitive impairment, so which impacts on a participant's ability to even carry out the simplest tasks day to day. So let's have a look at because I suppose what people say to me is, well, how does this relate to social and community participation? How does supporting someone how to have a routine, or how does supporting someone to live healthy relate to social and economic participation? So let's look at the example that we used before. How will a support worker, so if we're looking at linking in a support worker for a person, how will a support worker undertake activities that will support the participant to increase their social and economic participation within their local community? Okay, so the support worker is required to assist the participant to access, manage, and maintain the volunteering opportunity in their community due to the person's limited capacity to learn and process new information and communicate their needs. So another example, say this was in relation to a person with a psychosocial disability. A support worker might be required to learn new skills to maintain their tenancy so they are not homeless, or to increase their energy and resilience so they can work towards achieving their goal of volunteering or getting out in the community to reduce that social isolation. So how will this support increase their social and economic participation? This support will increase the person's capacity to learn how to manage their finances and pay their bills on time, or how to eat and cook healthy food to improve their energy and health. So it's really about how will the support increase their ability to access and participate in community. Hopefully that's given you a couple of examples. So think about it from another perspective. If a person doesn't have good health, if they don't have if they're really socially isolated, if they are bound to their house, if they don't have that ability to leave their house or feel comfortable or have the skills and ability and the independence within their own home, then it often creates barriers to accessing community because they have, it might be a fear or a phobia, or it might be that they just don't have the energy or the resilience to do it. So thinking about how those supports will increase that capacity. Okay. Right, let's move on. What time have we got, Cindy? Okay, we're getting there. So likely to be effective and beneficial. This is a really tricky one. So likely to be effective and beneficial, what does this actually mean? The NDIS will consider if there is evidence that the support being requested is considered current good practice. What this means is that it's a support that is commonly used with evidence that there are good outcomes able to be achieved with people with similar impairments due to the impact of their disability. So for example, the example around a support worker, is there good evidence that that's actually a good practice, that it's actually had really good outcomes? So also, is there evidence that that support required is both effective and beneficial for the participant based on their own unique disability-related support needs? So even though someone has a diagnosis through a disability, the impact on that person is often unique based on their own personal situation and the environment that they live in. So the most common evidence a support coordinator provides on a participant's behalf is an occupational therapy functional capacity assessment. So these generally detail the functional impairment and the impact on a person's disability, how a support being recommended relates to a participant's goal, how the support will be effective in relation to the barriers the support will help to overcome, and how the support is beneficial. So what results or outcomes will be achieved by providing that support. Okay. The NDIS also states, for a support to be approved, there needs to be a consensus of expert opinions. So what this actually means is that just because say for example, just because an occupational therapist as part of a functional capacity assessment is identifying that a person would likely benefit from psychology support, it wouldn't be enough for the NDIS to be able to say, okay, then we're going to provide psychology support. So what other evidence is there or consensus of expert opinion to substantiate the need for that support? So let's use that as an example. So a consensus of opinions would then be around getting an assessment done by a psychologist. So a psychologist actually doing an assessment for that person to corroborate the recommendation by the occupational therapy support. So they might actually meet with the person once, do an assessment and say, based on the information that we provided and the impact of their disability and the goals for the participant, you know, this is how we would provide the support and this is the recommended level of support that's required. So that's just an example. Okay. How are we going? Good? Good for time. Okay. Value for money. Interesting, this one. Okay, so what do the NDIS mean by this? The NDIS will assess whether the cost of the support is reasonable when considering the benefits of the support and the cost of other relevant or relative supports. So this directly relates to the financial sustainability of the scheme. So the NDIS considers if other supports would achieve the same result at a substantially lower cost. Say, for example, you were requesting assistive technology. Is it more, say, for example, you are requesting assistive technology around the purchase of a wheelchair? Would it be more beneficial to repair a wheelchair that is still appropriate and meets the person's disability-related needs, or is it more beneficial to purchase a new wheelchair because the person has a change in their support needs? So it could be a child who has grown and has outgrown the wheelchair, or you might provided evidence around that the person's had the wheelchair for a certain period of time, and that there has been a number of repairs, and they've got to a point now where they can't repair it anymore. Or they might need a wheelchair with additional functionality due to a deterioration in their capacity to mobilise or get around by themselves. So thinking about value for money, what is the long-term benefit? Yeah. So if there is evidence that the support will substantially improve a person's life stage outcomes and benefit the participants' long-term goals. So for example, psychology support for a participant transitioning from school to manage their challenging behaviours so that they can learn new skills and cope with differences in change in environments, change in process, change in the way that they do things. So thinking about, is it related to a person's life stages and how will that increase their capacity so that long term they may need less support? They also consider if the support will likely reduce the cost of other supports over time. So for example, if you provide speech therapy for a participant to increase their skills and capacity to communicate more independently, so in the future, it is likely that it will reduce the need for a support worker to help that person access and communicate their needs within the community. That's just another example. Okay. They also consider how the cost another thing that they might consider, so there's a number of variables, and there's a number of things that this might relate to in relation to value for money. So another thing that you consider, how the cost compares to other supports of the same kind in the person's geographical area. So for example, if you are working in a rural and remote area and you are engaging a support that is quite a high cost, and it might be in relation to being able to get that support within a rural area. So there might be additional costs around travel, there might be additional costs around the service, all that kind of stuff. Part of that value for money is in relation to due to the geographical area. Okay. If the support will increase the participant's independence, so in effect, reduce the need for other supports in the future. So for example, a good example is around home modifications. So say a person is requesting home modifications to make a bathroom more accessible. This will increase their independence and around their ability to meet their personal care needs. So they may need less support to help them to do that. So again, value for money can mean a lot of things, but it's thinking about the long-term benefit of that support. Okay. Keep going. Right. Got a bit to go yet. A lot of information where reasonable necessary. Okay. Is the support something that NDIS would reasonably expect the participants' informal supports, like their family, friends, their natural connections, their informal network to provide? So for this criteria, the NDIS consider what the person can do for themselves and any support they received from others in their support network to be able to complete activities within their daily life. So is it emotional? Is it physical? Is it psychological? What kind of support do they provide? So I've broken this down for children under the age of 18 years old and adults over the age of 18 years old, because there's quite different things that the NDIS will look at. So for children under the age of 18, so what the NDIS look at is whether their support needs are substantially greater due to the impact of their disability compared to children of the same age without a disability. So what the NDIS are really looking at that is what are the societal expectations or norms around how or what support a parent should provide for a child. So for example, if you are requesting out-of-home support for a child with a disability, why do they need the support? What is the functional impact of the child's disability, and how are their support needs substantially greater than other children without a disability of the same age? How does this place significant pressure on the caring role? So, and the other thing that you need to really identify is how will the support relieve this pressure and increase the carer's capacity to parent the child safely within the home? So these are prompts for you to think about and to have discussions with a family to really drill down in, is the support a reasonable expectation that as a parent you would provide the support? Or is it in relation, directly related to the impact of a person's disability? And how does that impact? What is the impact on the caring role? And how will it increase capacity for that child to remain safely within the family home? Another thing that the NDIS consider is if there are any risks to the well-being of people providing informal support to the participant. So, for example, how resilient is that support network? So I'll give you an example. So if a parent, say a parent is struggling with managing a child's quite challenging behaviours, so they could be causing like physical or emotional harm within the family, and the carer are really struggling around that. So recommending psychology support to develop a behaviour management plan, to increase the parent's ability to manage those behaviours and keep the child safe. So that's another thing to think about when we're talking about informal supports. It's not just about saying, well, the parent shouldn't have to provide the support, or the parent does provide that support and they can no longer do that. You need to provide evidence about what is the impact, why is the support required, and what is the outcome that you're hoping to achieve. Okay. You also need to be considering how sustainable is that support for that parent or that carer to provide. And if it's not sustainable, why is it not sustainable? And what is the impact what is the impact of a person's disability? How does that impact on the caring role? And then how by putting that support in place will it increase their capacity to care for that child safely within the family home? Sorry, getting very mixed up with my words today. Okay, last one for under 18. They also consider if the support will help the participant to build their skills and capacity in the future, or reduce risk for a participant. So I'll give you another example. So by providing psychology support for a teenager who is transitioning from school to manage their quite challenging behaviours. So you could have a teenager who's at school, and they are really struggling around the impact of their disability. They're really struggling with the social environment, managing their emotions, don't really deal really well with change. By putting psychology and support in place, it will support that teenager to build their capacity and skills around how to manage that change in environment, change in situation, but also to develop social skills. So moving from a primary school to a high school is a completely different environment. It's hard enough for our children to go from primary school to high school. It's a huge change in their environment. It's a huge change in peer pressure and social skills that they need, never mind a person with a disability needing to navigate that transition. So thinking again, what is the impact of their disability? What are the barriers and risks for this person? How, by putting the support in place, will create capacity for this person to learn new skills, gain more confidence, be more independent. Need to be able to evidence those needs. Okay. I'm going to keep moving because we're running out of time very quickly. Okay, reasonable expectation of informal support. So this is the other part of the informal supports. What about a person who's over the 18? I often get asked by support coordinators, but the person I'm supporting isn't a child, they're an adult. So how does this criteria relate to adults? Okay, So in relation to adults, if there are risks to the participants' informal supports, if they rely on them to provide the support. So if the person is an adult and they're living in home, and there's some risk around that care continuing. So do they have elderly carers that can no longer provide that support? Does that support now longer, is that place within the home no longer sustainable? So again, coming about back to the resilience and the ability for that carer to continue to provide that level of support. Is that support network still sustainable? So I'll give you another example. Say a participant has a sister who is providing quite a lot of in-home support and helping out with transporting that person to access their community, but it's no longer sustainable because there's been a deterioration in the person's health, but also there's been a deterioration, and so there's been a breakdown in that relationship between that person and their sister. And so that support is no longer sustainable. There needs to be a support funded by the NDIS because it's directly related to that person's support needs. So we need to be exploring alternative options to meet that gap in support needs. Okay, another thing that they may look at in relation to reasonable expectation of informal supports for someone over the age of 18 is whether a participant may be socially isolated and does not have any formal supports in place. So are additional supports required because they're socially isolated and they don't actually have informal supports, and the support will increase their connection to local community and build a resilient network of supports around them to replace that lack of informal support networks with structure in place. Okay. It also might be around looking at circles of support, or there might be supports that you're putting in place, say for a support worker to support a person to go out into the community so they can actually explore their community and find out what they actually want to do and build some of those natural connections. Okay, provided by another service system. We're nearly there. I think I've gone too far. I have gone too far. Come back. Okay. No, I was right. Okay. Provided by another funded service system. Okay, we're nearly there. Okay, so this is referring obviously to mainstream or other government service systems. And this is a common term, NDIS, all the time, mainstream interface. So that's the interface between the NDIS, what the NDIS is responsible for, and what other service systems are responsible for. So if you are working with a participant who is part of the child protection system, what are child protection responsible for? What is the NDIS responsible for? Okay. Again, you can refer to the NDIS operational guidelines, mainstream and community supports. Really good detail in there to detail what each service system is responsible for, as well as the operational guidelines around the justice system. So what is the support coordinator's role? Okay. Okay. Something to be aware of, I suppose, with these systems is that quite often when we are working with a participant and they have a lot of mainstream services or there's other government services involved, sometimes they will say to us, yep, we know we're supposed to be providing that service, but we don't have capacity, we don't have the resources to provide that service. Just because they say that doesn't necessarily mean that the NDIS is then the most appropriate service to provide that level of support. Often they will say that's their responsibility. We acknowledge that there's a gap in the need, but they won't necessarily fund it, which really is quite frustrating because it really identifies the gaps between that mainstream interface. So part of the support coordinator role is really then to look at, well, it's our role to really have the skills to negotiate with those mainstream services, to understand what it is that they are responsible for. And these are part of the agreements that were made prior to the NDIA being rolled out, or that scheme being rolled out by all of these mainstream services. So if you are supposed to be providing this service and you're saying that you don't have it available, that you don't have the resources available, or that you're full, our role is then to go, so what can you provide? So instead of saying, oh, okay, you can't do that, there's going to be a gap in service provision, our role is really then to negotiate. So this is my role as a support coordinator, and this is how the NDIS works. Your responsibility within this mainstream service is to provide this service and support for this participant. Yeah. So our role is then to go, so if you can't, you're saying you can't do it, well, what can you do? How can we, what supports do you have available that we can link this participant into? And how can we work together collaboratively to ensure this participant's needs are met? Okay, we're getting very close. Last bit. That's the last criteria. So when we're talking about whether the NDIS is the most appropriate option, we're looking at, mainly they're referring to mainstream options, but also as a support coordinator, you need to be looking at when you're looking at a support recommended by a participant, you've met all the other NDIS disability related criteria, reasonable necessary criteria. You also need to be providing evidence that the support isn't available within the community, the local community. It's not funded within the local community or available within the local community, and it's not able to be provided or should be provided by mainstream services. And so, in effect, evidencing that the NDIS is the most appropriate option. Okay, last bit. Supports NDIA will not fund. So supports that the NDIS won't fund. And this really helps with supporting a person to build their capacity to understand how it all works. So someone might be saying to you, you might say to them, well, would the support likely cause any harm? Is the support related to your disability? You've already kind of discussed that criteria right at the beginning. Is the support duplicated by other agencies? Yeah, that's also meeting part of the NDIS criteria. So these are the kind of things that you're ticking off. Is the support considered a day-to-day living cost? So rent or groceries, things like that. And these are day-to-day living costs that are not attributable to the functional impact of a person's disability. Really, really important. Is the support against the law? Pretty common things, pretty reasonable, well, not reasonable, but pretty sensible things. And again, is it the responsibility of other service systems? So by going through that criteria, it really helps you to really help a person build their capacity. So again, just reinforcing before we go, it is important for a support coordinator to truly understand what the reasonable necessary decision-making criteria is so that you could help a participant and their support network. So you might be talking to a psychologist or an OT or a support worker or a CIL organisation, and they might be recommending all these supports. You could be doing this within a case review meeting. You could be, and it's not about going through each different criteria, it's about understanding it and using that practice framework to problem solve whether the NDIS is likely the best option to fund the support. So it's building, that comes back to that capacity building role. It also directly links to your reporting responsibility to the NDIS. So when you're doing your reporting, I often have support coordinators say to me, I don't understand why that support wasn't funded. And then when we go back through the reasonable necessary criteria, there's not a lot of evidence or any evidence that substantiates that it's reasonable and necessary. Okay, that's it. A lot of information, I know. We're going to move on and hopefully close the session. We're not going to have time to actually answer any questions, but what I will do is I will get Endeavour to send the questions to me and I will respond to them directly. I will get the NDIA, sorry, I'll get Endeavour to send them out to you. So thank you very much, everyone. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Mary. That was a lot of information and extremely informative. Thank you. Really appreciate it. Just quickly, thanks, everyone. We'll go through all the unanswered questions and we will provide a response. Now for the Lucky Door Prize winner, I hope you're still with us. The winner is Chantel Best. So our Endeavour Foundation representative will be in touch with you. Congratulations. We do appreciate any feedback that you can provide us. So please complete our feedback form, which you can find the link in the chat box. It will help to inform us on which topics are of interest to you for future sessions. So the next webinar topic will cover understanding conflict of interest. You will receive the registration link in your inbox very soon. We do hope to see you at our upcoming webinar next month. And thank you so much to Shania and also to Mary for facilitating today's topic. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week ahead.